Somewhere in England right now, there is a homeowner who did everything right. They saved for a deposit. They passed the mortgage checks. They own on paper a flat worth over £500,000. And under a law that is still fully enforced today, they could lose every penny of it. Not because they stopped paying their mortgage, not because they went bankrupt, but because of a legal mechanism buried in a 2002 act called forfeiture. Here's how it actually happened to one leaseholder. He installed a bathroom in his flat. Reports say he did so in apparent breach of a clause in his lease. The freeholder went to court. The flat, worth £600,000, was forfeited. Not fined, not sued for damages, forfeited. The freeholder took the entire property and, under the law as it stands, was under no obligation to hand back a penny of the value the leaseholder had built up in it. You read that correctly. In the United Kingdom in 2026, it is still completely legal for a freeholder to take total ownership of a six-figure home over a dispute that could, technically, involve as little as a few £100s. The law that allows this is Section 167 of the Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002, and it sets the threshold at just £350. If you owe £350 or more and part of that debt has been outstanding for more than 3 years, your freeholder has the legal right to start proceedings to take your home. There's no set-off. It doesn't matter if your flat is worth 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times that debt. You lose all of it. Mark the date in your calendar. Circle it in red ink. July 27th, 2026. This is the day the government is legally required to tell 5 million leaseholders across England and Wales whether it is finally going to end this. For years, the government has called leasehold a feudal system. The housing minister himself has stood up in Parliament and used that exact word. They have promised repeatedly to abolish forfeiture, cap ground rents, and hand homeowners real control over their own buildings. But promises from Westminster on leasehold reform have a habit of slipping, sometimes by years. And right now, this entire reform package is sitting in limbo, waiting on a government response that is legally due in a matter of days. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how forfeiture works and why almost every leasehold flat owner in the country is currently exposed to it. I'm going to break down the 3 separate ways this reform could still fail leaseholders, even after everything Parliament has already agreed to. And I'm going to tell you exactly what to do before July 27th if you want your voice counted in one of the biggest shakeups of UK property law in a generation. Stay to the end, because the third villain in this story, the one hiding in plain sight in your service charge bill, is the one almost nobody is talking about. Let's get into it. To understand why July 27th matters, you first have to understand what leasehold actually is and why forfeiture has been allowed to exist for so long. When you buy a leasehold flat in England, you don't fully own your home. You own the right to live in it for a fixed number of years on the lease, while a separate person or company, the freeholder, owns the building and the ground beneath it. You pay them ground rent, you pay them, or a managing agent working on their behalf, service charges to maintain the building. And buried in almost every one of these agreements is a forfeiture clause, the freeholder's right to take the entire property back if you breach the terms. For most of the last century, this clause was rarely enforced because it was rarely necessary. But over the past 2 decades, freeholders and the managing agents working for them have increasingly used the mere threat of forfeiture as a debt collection tool. Leasehold campaigners in Parliament have described this as the chilling effect that results from its mere existence. You don't actually need to go through with a forfeiture to make it terrifying. You just need a leaseholder to know it's possible. Under Sections 167 and 168 of the 2002 Act, a freeholder can't forfeit a lease for arrears unless the leaseholder has admitted the debt, or a court or tribunal has formally ruled on it, and the total owed must be above £350 with at least part of it overdue for 3 years. That sounds like a reasonable safeguard until you realize what it means in practice. A leaseholder who disputes a service charge, refuses to pay a bill they consider unfair, and loses that argument 3 years later, can be forfeited over it. The size of the debt and the value of the home have no relationship to each other whatsoever, and forfeiture doesn't even require the leaseholder to lose in a fair fight. The The process starts with something called a Section 146 notice, a formal warning that gives the leaseholder a window to remedy the breach. In theory, you can apply to the court for what's called relief from forfeiture and pay everything you owe to keep your home. In practice, that requires knowing the process exists, finding the money fast, and often paying the freeholder's legal costs on top of the original debt. Costs that many leases allow the freeholder to pass straight back onto the leaseholder through the service charge. For anyone who's ill, elderly, going through a divorce, or simply doesn't open a post they're frightened of, that window can close before they even realize it was open. This is precisely why members of the House of Lords have called forfeiture anachronistic and wholly disproportionate. Because the leaseholder isn't just risking a fine, they're risking their entire home over what a judge in a small claims court would treat as a minor debt. If this is the first time you're hearing how exposed leaseholders actually are under current law, subscribe now. Every week, we're breaking down exactly what's changing in UK property law before it hits the headlines, and this reform is moving fast. So, where does July 27th actually come in? On January 27th, 2026, the government published the draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill for pre-legislative scrutiny, the follow-up to years of promises. It proposes 3 headline changes: capping ground rents on existing leases at £250 a year, tapering down to a peppercorn, effectively zero, after 40 years, abolishing forfeiture outright and replacing it with a new court-supervised enforcement scheme, and making Commonhold, a form of ownership where leaseholders jointly own their building outright, the default tenure for new flats. There's a fourth piece, too. The bill proposes making it easier for existing leaseholders to escape the system entirely by converting their building to Commonhold, full outright ownership with no freeholder above them, if just 50% of qualifying leaseholders in the building agree. Right now, that threshold is effectively 100%. It takes just one objecting leaseholder, one absent freeholder, or one unresponsive lender to block an entire building from converting. Having that threshold sounds technical, but for the roughly 5 million leasehold properties in England and Wales, around 38% of all homes in the private housing stock, it's the difference between conversion staying theoretical and conversion actually happening at scale. On 27th May 2026, the Cross-Party Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee published its verdict after months of evidence sessions with leaseholders, freeholders, lawyers, and civil servants. Their conclusion: the bill is a real step forward, but it doesn't go far enough, fast enough. 56 separate conclusions and recommendations. They want the £250 ground rent cap brought forward to late 2027 instead of the government's proposed 2028. They want the 40-year taper to be shortened, possibly to just 20 years, because nobody in the government has been able to explain why 40 was chosen over 20. And under parliamentary convention, the government has exactly 2 months from the date of that report to respond to every single recommendation. 2 months from 27th May lands on 27th July. That's the date. Here's what's actually at stake if that response is weak. Or if, like so much leasehold reform before it, the can gets kicked further down the road. Villain 1. The forfeiture gap. The draft bill does propose abolishing forfeiture, but read the fine print. Certain breaches are being carved out of the new enforcement scheme entirely, including ground rent arrears and other non-payment breaches below a threshold the government hasn't even set yet. According to the government's own consultation documents, that threshold will land somewhere between £500 and £5,000. Somewhere. Nobody currently knows the number, and until it's fixed in regulations, and until the whole new scheme is actually switched on, the existing £350 threshold under the 2002 Act remains fully live law. Every leaseholder currently in dispute with their freeholder today is exposed to precisely the same risk as the man who lost his £600,000 flat over a bathroom. Villain 2. The vanishing ground rent cap. £250 a year sounds simple. It isn't guaranteed. The government's own policy statement says it's aiming for implementation in 2028. The committee is pushing for late 2027, but both dates depend on the final bill clearing a second reading, a committee stage, a report stage, and royal assent. And the committee itself only expects the amended bill to reach Parliament in autumn 2026, with royal assent hoped for by mid-2027 at the very earliest. Every one of those stages is a place the timeline can slip. We've seen exactly this before. The Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act received royal assent back in May 2024. And as of today, in July 2026, huge parts of it, including ground rent reforms it was meant to deliver, are still not in force. Leaseholders currently paying over £600 million a year in ground rents combined are being told again to wait and see. And the housing minister himself has already hinted that the boldest promise in this whole package, banning leasehold outright for new flats, may not even switch on within this parliament at all, meaning it could be pushed past the next general election before it ever takes effect. Villain 3, the unregulated managing agent. And here's the one almost nobody is talking about. The draft bill, as it stands, does nothing to regulate the managing agents who actually run your building day to day. The ones who send the service charge demands, decide whether repairs happen, and can be the difference between a well-run block and a nightmare. The committee's report explicitly flagged this as a significant shortcoming. In Parliament just last week, MPs stood up and named specific managing agents their own constituents are stuck with, describing the current state of the industry as a Wild West. An independent regulator with real power to fine agents and revoke their licenses was first recommended in the House of Lords back in 2019. It is now the middle of 2026, and it still doesn't exist. Whatever happens to forfeiture and ground rents on July 27th, the day-to-day power imbalance between leaseholders and the people managing their buildings doesn't shift an inch unless this gets fixed too. 3 villains, one common thread. Every single one of them can be softened, delayed, or watered down between now and royal assent. And the only real check on that happening is public pressure in the next few weeks, while the government is actually drafting its response. Go back to that man and his £600,000 flat. Under the bill exactly as drafted today, if his dispute had fallen just under whatever threshold the government eventually sets, or if the new enforcement scheme simply wasn't switched on yet when his case happened, the outcome doesn't change. He still loses the flat. That is not a hypothetical for the roughly 5 million leaseholders across England and Wales right now. Every single one of them owns their home on exactly the same legal footing he did. The reform on the table could fix this. Whether it actually will depends on what the government commits to in writing by July 27th. So, what can you actually do with this before then? First, if you're a leaseholder, check your own lease for a forfeiture clause and know where you stand. The Leasehold Advisory Service, Lease, offers free guidance on exactly this, and it costs nothing to ask. Second, if you're in a dispute over a service charge or ground rent you believe is unfair, don't let it just sit unresolved for 3 years hoping it goes away. Get it formally determined by the first-tier tribunal rather than letting an unpaid debt quietly run down the clock against you. An unresolved argument today can become a legal ground for losing your home in 2029. Third, write to your MP before July 27th. Campaign groups like the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership and the National Leasehold Campaign have been tracking this bill line by line since January and publish template letters you can adapt in minutes. The government has to respond to the committee either way, but a wave of constituent letters in the days before that deadline is one of the few levers ordinary leaseholders actually have on a live piece of legislation. Fourth, if your building has never seriously discussed collective enfranchisement or converting to Commonhold, this is the moment to raise it with your neighbors. Because if the 50% threshold does make it into the final bill, buildings that are already organized will be first through the door. This bill is not finished. The window to influence it is closing, but it isn't closed yet. If you're a leaseholder and a managing agent has ever threatened forfeiture over a bill you couldn't challenge, tell us what happened in the comments below. These are exactly the stories MPs need to hear before the 27th. If this video helped you understand what's actually on the line, hit subscribe, because we'll be covering the government's response the moment it lands. And if you want to understand how leaseholders ended up this exposed in the first place, go back and watch our video on the £100,000 cladding bill trapping London leaseholders right now. It's the other half of this exact same crisis. I'll see you in the next one.